Right. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining our seance with Mr. Whistler. I'm Joan Harper. I'm the membership secretary for the Whistler Society. And just wanted to spend a few minutes to do some general Zoom housekeeping with you. I know you probably are all very much Zoom experts, but let me just share some of our best practices with you here. So in order to see the screen in the best way when we are able to call Mr. Whistler, it's in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You should see a square that says view, and you should be selecting speaker view. And then if you do want to have a chat during the seance, you can just click on the chat button down here. You'll be muted now until we go to the Q&A. And if you need to change your video settings, you can click the up arrow here. So without, oh, and let me just add one more person. And yes, so without further ado, if I could ask you all to hold hands and assist me in calling for Mr. James McNeill Whistler. Can we join hands and send out to the universe our request to have you join us? James McNeill Whistler, are you there?
I can hear you. I see. Lovely.
We've done it. For the fourth time in a row, Mr. Whistler, we have managed to call you forth.
Excellent, excellent. Now, may I just check? This is the James Whistler Appreciation Society, correct?
James McNeill Whistler, yes.
Excellent, excellent. You know, I recently popped into a seance where I thought they were calling me, and when I arrived, they started addressing me as Rex Whistler. And I assured them that they did not refer to me as king. I hold no such titles. They could call me Mr.
Wait.
Mute by mistake.
Yes. Sorry. Where is he?
Ah.
Sorry.
I've been muted. Perhaps you were expecting Rex Whistler after all.
No, I'm very sorry about that, Mr. Whistler. Technical glitch there.
That's perfectly all right. As long as you are here to see James Whistler and not any other Whistler who has some pretensions to be king of art, then I am your man.
Well, we are delighted, and there is no other Whistler for the members of the Whistler Society but you.
Excellent, excellent.
Now, let's get on with the questions. The subject matter of our seance tonight is you and your female models. Our first question comes from Stephen Bartley. Stephen, can I ask you to unmute and ask your question?
Good evening, Mr. Whistler.
Good evening.
It's wonderful to see you in front of one of your wonderful nocturnes, the River Thames. Thank you. Thank you for coming. My question is, as a young artist in Paris, you lived with several of your models. Was this a common practice among artists? I believe one of them, by the name of Trumet, was so upset with your behavior that in a fury she burned and destroyed some of your work.
Well, I don't recall living with several models, certainly not at the same time. But yes, it was fairly common in my bohemian circle to share quarters with high-spirited young women. Is that not still true? I hope that is still a practice for young artists. Most of our models were working-class girls, grisettes, as they were known. They were mostly shop girls or in the millinery or dressmaking trades. Now, the bourgeoisie thought of artist models as prostitutes, so it was difficult to convince respectable women to pose. And professional models cost 2 or 3 francs per day. That was far beyond our means as a regular thing. Now, you mentioned one of my models, Fumette. Her name was Eloise, and all my friends thought her remarkable for both her beauty and her intelligence. Now, she shared my bohemian inclinations at the time, and she adored romantic poetry, but she had a temper, too, and she was also known as La Tigresse. She did rip dozens of my beautiful drawings to shreds one day, and just because I had been flirting, quite harmlessly, I assure you, with some other girls.
Thank you.
Thank you for that very interesting comment about Fumette, who is really known as Eloise. Our next question is from Sandra Higgins. Sandra, can you unmute?
Yes, I'm here.
Sandra.
Yes. Well, hello, Mr. Whistler. You're looking as dapper and charismatic as usual.
Oh, thank you.
I can see why the ladies were all after you. My goodness.
Well, I wouldn't say so myself, but it was very pleasant to be among the living. Let's just say that.
Well, which was the most pleasant to be with? Who was your favorite model, and why?
I'm not entirely sure what you mean by favorite. Now, do you mean somebody that I had a sentimental or emotional attachment to? Then that would be my wife, Trixie. And even though she only posed for what you would consider a formal portrait in oils, I did enjoy the society of other models. I was physically attracted to a few of them. Admittedly, the case with Mrs. Leyland and Lady Archibald Campbell, but that was nothing compared to my wham, as I often called Trixie. Now, if you mean by favorite, a model whom I considered an ideal sitter, now we're having a very different conversation. Now, naturally, Joe and Maude, besides the emotional attachment, they served my purposes admirably. But then several women, if following my instructions, proved able. I think of Millie Finch, the Pettigrew sisters, even my sister-in-law Ethel. But then, after all, a picture is not about the sitter, but the artist. So you might as well ask, who was my favorite artist? I decline to answer that question.
I might know the answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra, for that interesting question and informative answer from Mr. Whistler. Mr. Whistler, we now have a question from Jane Cohen, but she is a bit under the weather. She is on the call, and she's asked me if I would ask the question for her, which I'm happy to do. The question is, did you ever regard any model as your muse, perhaps even your mother in that role?
My mother. Well, let me answer that question as best I'm able. I've heard that term bandied about, muse, but really it's a word quite like favorite that I never really considered or was aware of at the time. I painted or I drew some portraits because I happened to catch the model sitting or standing in a certain way. I recall doing an etching of Joe, which I call weary under those kind of circumstances. And likewise, there was a painting of Trixie, Harmony in red, because the lamplight illuminated her in a certain way. And I also recall a little vendor girl whose costume and attitude I wanted to capture. I called the painting Chelsea Girl. Now, all of these suggest a type of inspiration, but I was just as likely to be inspired by a poem or the work of another artist, a dead one, of course. And as for my mother, now I adored my mother, but I would hardly say that she inspired my portrait of her, unless you regard a simple desire to immortalize one's mother and express your affection for her as a type of inspiration.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much for that. I think we have a question now from Sarah Bogosian. You'll remember Sarah. She's the president of the Whistler House Museum
Of
in
course.
Massachusetts. Sarah, can you please unmute and ask your question?
Speak up, but I can't hear.
Oh, here we go. There you go. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Oh, Mr. Whistler, you look fabulous, and it's wonderful to be with you and all of the other Whistler Society members. I wish I was there with you. My question has to do with your muse. Again, many people today think of Joanna Hiffernan as your muse. How did you think of her then, and how do you regard her now?
Ah, Joe. Well, as I just said, I don't know that I would consider her or really any of my models as a muse. They were inspired by all kinds of things, my paintings. For example, my first white girl, which seemingly one of my most highly regarded portraits, that was inspired not by the model, but by a poem by Charles Baudelaire. Now, I adored Jo as long as we were together, and I have nothing but fond memories of her even now. She made my life easier by attending to domestic and financial matters, which allowed me to concentrate on my art. As a model, she always managed to project the look and the attitude that I saw, but I don't think she really influenced my art in any dramatic way. That said, I am glad to still see that her name is associated with mine, and I believe I'm told that there is my relationship with her, which is wonderful.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Nice to see you also. So next we have Susie Hyde. Susie, would you like to ask your question?
Certainly. So, Mr. Whistler, your appreciation for the female form is clear. Did you prefer drawing and painting women rather than men?
Oh, absolutely, and beyond any doubt, I preferred not only painting them and drawing them, I preferred their company. I preferred them as artists. So to me, they were a much more interesting sex. And you know, aren't women more beautiful than men? It is not the purpose of art to capture and express beauty. That's what I always thought. I also enjoyed just talking to them. I thought they're more agreeable, they're more interesting. I liked their conversation. I enjoyed the opportunity to flirt with them. And women, particularly in their dress, are also more colorful than men. And you have to recall that when I was amongst the living, men wore basic black when they weren't wearing dull gray. Those were our choices back then. And I love to depict women in the latest fashions. And you will notice that I invariably portrayed men, or nearly always, frontally, that is, dead on. Whereas I usually had women, at least in my best full-length portraits, I had them turned to one side or otherwise positioned. And this was so that you could see their costume and really get the full view of that. Now, of course, this was all before the 1890s, when I painted far fewer full-length portraits.
Thank you. Thank you.
Very illuminating. Thank you, Susie, for that question. Martin Riley, the chairman of the Whistler Society, has the next question.
Well,
Also,
thank you. Thank you so much. I will raise a glass to the spirit of James McNeill Whistler. Welcome to our real world from your ethereal world.
I see you're drinking white wine, aren't you?
I am drinking white wine.
White wine, yes. Stephen is drinking red wine. Now, you know that at my parties, I often would serve white wine. And the reason is that people who know wine, like Stephen obviously does, prefer red. So the people who knew less and would be less likely to criticize my choice, they wouldn't know if I served white wine.
Well, I take that opprobrium with great cheer. Thank you so much. Congratulations on being with us. Following on from Susie's comment, the choice of a female model over a male. The male would be portrayed face on, but how would you set the pose for a female model? Would it be a result of their coquettishness or your desire to produce a form?
That's a very interesting question. I'm glad to see the wine has not yet gotten to you. It's not an easy question to answer, however. Sometimes an obvious pose presented itself. For instance, it was natural for me to paint Connie Gilchrist as a skipping rope dancer because that was her act at the Gaiety Theater. And I also just mentioned my desire to show off a woman's costume. Now, with commission portraits, a lady might already have decided how she wished to pose, but she was always willing for me to arrange her dress to the best advantage. Now, in addition to the pose, I would also determine what the model should wear, even in commission portraits. For instance, for my portrait of Cicely Alexander, I told her mother what materials must be used in making the dress, which I insisted be a fine Indian muslin, and I then added a gray sash around her waist. I did mention earlier being inspired by the work of previous artists. Now, this happened most often in my younger years when I foolishly thought I must emulate some master. But a good example is an etching of Fumet called Venus, where Rembrandt was clearly my inspiration. Velasquez, too, and some Japanese masters influenced the look of several portraits, as in Princess from the Land of Porcelain. I'm not sure that fully answered your question, but I think that's as close as I can get right now.
Well, very illuminating. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Our host has gone on mute too. It seems to be quite popular these days.
Thank you for keeping me in line. Our next question is from Bob Roach. And Bob has already unmuted, unlike me.
Thank you, James. Good evening, Mr. Whistler. It's lovely to see you again, and greetings from Lowell, Massachusetts. Your birthplace. I don't live too far from the house where you were born, and it's
where they say I was born. Yes,
where they say you were born, and we have some proof of that too here. But that's for another seance. My question is this: when painting a familiar model, you were aware of her character and physical attributes, but when painting a new sitter, did you allow time to get to know her in order to produce a sympathetic, perceptive, and representational portrait?
That is an interesting question as well. But I have to take issue with a couple of terms that use sympathetic and representational. What do these words have to do with art? I have told the world that art must be independent of all this kind of claptrap. Art should stand alone and appeal to the artistic senses without confounding this with emotions or purposes entirely foreign to it. I titled my work Harmonies and Symphonies and Arrangements to distance them from any emotional association or even from some visual expectation. My portraits, like all my paintings, etchings, and lithographs, they're delicate balances of lines and color and nothing more. The person posing is incidental to all that. So did I get to know them? It was outside of my purpose, shall we say. Even the portrait of my mother. Now that has obvious emotional value for me, but it was not presented to the world as a sentimental representation of filial devotion or piety, although this is apparently what it has now become. Rather, it is an arrangement in gray and black. To me, it was interesting as a picture of my mother, but what can or ought the public to care about the identity of the model?
Thank you, Mr. Whistler.
Thank you.
That was a very interesting response, Mr. Whistler. Thank you for that. Our next question comes from Patrick Duffy, who's had a very difficult commute home, and I'm not sure, but I think he's on his phone. Patrick, can I ask you to unmute?
Hello, Joan.
Patrick, we have
Ah,
you.
you've made it.
Absolutely. I'm coming to Mr. Whistler from the dark side. My connection is more limited than yours, I think.
Ah,
But I'm thrilled to be able to have ask you.
Patrick, you've just gone on mute again. This does seem to be an issue on this particular call. I think you need to unmute again. There you go.
Am I here again?
You're here.
Sorry. You know. Hey. Most of your compositions with musical titles, but how do you name your portraits?
When it's mentally come from someone to like be your cheerleader and tell you,
ah. I think someone else has an answer too, but perhaps mine is what you're seeking. I believe I've just
understand the question, Mr. Whistler. I just want to make sure that because
I think I did, Patrick. I think you were asking. I do name a lot of my compositions with musical titles, but how did I name my portraits? Now, I've kind of just suggested my answer. I cannot say all my portraits have musical titles. They don't. Some paintings, both commissioned and independent, were just named for the sitter, as with Miss May Alexander, or given a generic title. I referred to Chelsea Girl before. Many such paintings, including one of my favorites of Lillian Wokes, were not exhibited during my lifetime. Had they been, I may well have added a musical title. Otherwise, the portraits, like any nocturne, were named for the dominant colors in the arrangement.
Well, I will thank you on behalf of Patrick so that he is relieved from having to open up his phone to the dark side again. And thank you for that insightful response. Our next question is from Josie Merck. Josie, do you want to unmute?
Okay. Evening for you, afternoon for me, Mr. Whistler. I'm calling you from the United States, New York, New York.
Lovely. Well, time has no meaning where I am, I assure you. So,
yes. Fabulous. Thank you for zooming into us. My question was originally going to be about what would you say to your sitter, woman, female, whatever, to get her in the pose, the mind that you would like for your painting. But you already have said a few things, such as the sitter would follow, if the sitter followed my instructions. And later you said, if the sitter would project the look and attitude that I sought. So I'm interested in that conversation you would have with these lovely ladies, if you wouldn't mind, unless you feel you've already answered it.
What would I ask them to, what would I talk to them about? You know, I didn't talk much. I was focused very intently on the painting at hand. I hope that in their silence that they were thinking about how I was making them immortal. But I'm sure that some of them had other thoughts on their mind. Professional models were used to posing, and they required little instruction or motivation, and God only knows what they thought about while they were standing there, but they stood extremely well. Now, people who were close to me personally, such as Jo and Maud and Trixie and her sisters, they posed to please me, and it was easy enough to chat with them, although that was not my practice with most models. Now, commission portraits presented the worst situations. I sometimes had to abbreviate those sessions in return for more frequent ones. I remember one instance. This was not a female model. This was a male model, John Cohen. When his wife accompanied him to sessions in order to read to him Treasure Island, of all things, while he was posing, but rather than keeping him focused, the reading more often distracted him, the result being much rubbing out and starting over on my behalf. Thinking back, this may be why I painted far fewer full-length portraits in the last decade of my life as I aged. You know, I'm reminded of something that my friend W.S. Gilbert once wrote in a lyric. I believe it was in The Pirates of Penzance, where he said, "A policeman's lot is not a happy one. The same is true for artists."
Well, I
Thank
think your
you.
lot. Thank you, Josie. Thank you for that. But I think your lot in life was a bit happier than a policeman. So next we have another question from Sandra Higgins. Sandra, you're back on.
Okay. Well, Mr. Whistler, you are a real taskmaster with your sitters, it seems. And because you're making them immortal, I suppose they don't have any chance to complain. Did any of them ever take objection to what you were doing, the pose, the length of time they had to stay still, the lack of conversation, if I'm gathering what you said? Other than La Tigresse, did you have any little rows with any of them?
I fear that many of them did not understand that posing for a work of art requires sacrifice and long hours holding a pose. So yes, they would complain. I sometimes sympathize with the young girls who objected. I remember my 12-year-old niece Annie bursting into tears over the hours required to complete the music group, even though she was seated. I had tried to make amends by giving her a lovely leather riding set, and I believe, now that I think about it, Cicely Alexander, she was 8 when I painted her. She also broke down in tears. I made amends by allowing her to rummage around the studio on days when the light was not right. But I think the pouting, petulant expression I gave her tells all. On the other hand, someone older, someone like Lady Mew, could be insufferable. Although she claimed to have enjoyed the numerous settings required for her 3 portraits, one never completed, we tangled over everything from the proper costume to the required pose. Now, that said, Val, if I may call her that, and we were kindred spirits, which lightened the mood. But some people think that just because they are paying a few £100 in commission, that they can dictate the terms of the settings or even what is to appear on the canvas. They fail to realize that the painting, regardless of who possesses it or who commissioned it or who is in it, will always be mine, and that I must have absolute control in creating it.
Thank you.
So, a bit of a perfectionist, are we?
Yes, I seek perfection in all things. So not just the pose and the costume, but the light, the mood, everything has to be under my control. And it has to allow me to recreate the image I have in mind.
Absolute control. I got it. Now, I have a 2-parter question for you. Yes, on behalf of Hallie Swanson, who is a member. However, she is en route back from the United States, having been visiting her mother there. So she is asking, did you pay models for posing? And the second question is, did your models like their portraits?
Did I pay them for posing? As infrequently as humanly possible, and as little as possible. That was one advantage of having, a frequent model, or a muse, if someone wants to use that term, like Joe or Maud living with me. But I must say that many people were perfectly willing to sit for me without payment, just as on occasion, Thomas Carlyle comes to mind. I was willing to undertake a major portrait without commission. As for professional models, the fees varied. I cannot recall precise amounts, but someone like Millie Finch, for instance, would have earned more than the Pettigrew sisters. Now, as for your second question, were you asking, did the models like their portraits?
Yes, exactly. Did they, were they happy with them afterwards?
I honestly don't recall any complaints, but what would it matter if they were happy or unhappy? What mattered was that I was happy. If I was satisfied with the painting, that was enough. I do recall Thomas Carlyle, again, a male subject. He accused me of spending more time perfecting the look of his clothes that he was pleased with the results. And as I mentioned, someone like Valmue might complain during the sittings, but be delighted with the finished portrait.
And that's all that matters, I'm sure.
Well, what matters is that I was delighted.
Is that you were happy, of course. We understand that. Martin Riley, we're back to you again with another question.
How's that? Following on from those comments, obviously your purpose was to create a portrait and on your terms. But did you ever change the style of portrait because of the model's suggestions or reactions to what you've done? Did they have any influence over you?
I suppose there's one instance that comes to mind where that was true. And to be honest, it's the only one that comes to mind. And that was the portrait of my mother. Now, I had originally intended to paint her at full length and standing, much as I did in an earlier etching of her. And she stood bravely for a few days, but it soon became clear that dear mother, who never complained, was not up to it. So I placed her in a chair and in a pose that everyone who knew her immediately recognized as her customary way of sitting. And they especially noticed the placement of her hands.
Thank you. Interesting. Thank you.
And I can sympathize, having portrayed your mother and took great pains to make sure that my hands were set as you set hers in that picture.
Wonderful.
Our next question is from Freda Matassa. Freda? Actually, yeah, there you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, it's Frida.
Sorry,
Hello,
Frida.
Frida.
Hello. Good evening, Mr. Whistler.
Good
My
evening.
question concerns your sister, Deborah.
Ah, Debo.
Yes, you appear to have painted all the important women in your life, but I don't know of any formal portrait of your sister, Deborah. Did you paint her? And if you didn't, why not?
Well, there is a very good reason why I never painted a formal portrait of Debo. She did appear in several early paintings and etchings, including, of course, At the Piano, the first painting I exhibited at the Royal Academy. And I probably would have done more with her, except, of course, for her insufferable husband, Seymour Hayden. You probably know that he and I quarreled, and that in his usual peevish way, he consequently forbade Debo from seeing any of our side of the family. She was eventually allowed to see Mother, but I had very little direct contact with my dear sister after about 1866. So that is why I never painted a formal portrait of Debo.
Oh, great pity. But thank you for your answer.
Thank you, Frida. Next we have up Diana Bartley. Diana, can I ask you to unmute?
I am unmuted.
Oh, you're...
Yes.
Hello.
Hello, Mr. Whistler. Now, I don't want to pry, and so many women's names have been mentioned, but I'm really curious, who was the little Rose of Lyme Regis?
Ah, little Rose of Lyme Regis. You know, she was a charming child. She was the daughter of the mayor of Lyme Regis, and I spent several weeks there in 1895. It was a depressing time for me. My dear Trixie had accompanied me there, but soon returned to London because of her health. I stayed on. I did some very good work in both painting and lithography. Now, I had painted portraits of children in the past, and did more of them subsequently, but I don't believe I ever captured the innocence and vulnerability of childhood as convincingly as with Rose. She was a bright spot during those morose days. She was only 9 years old and very nervous about setting, but I immortalized her. I do regret that I failed to exhibit the painting in my lifetime.
Yes, it's wonderful. She has a rather knowing look about her, but that's just my little interpretation. So ignore that. Ignore that.
She does have, I can't tell if it is knowing or perhaps she too was a little peeved by having to sit for so long. But I think she has an almost ethereal expression that really makes the portrait stand out.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, Diana, for that question. And it is very interesting to know the background of who this little girl was. And now we turn to Dan Sutherland for the next question. Dan, you'll remember, Mr. Whistler is Professor Emeritus and co-author of a book on your mother called Whistler's Mother. Dan.
Indeed.
Mr. Whistler, good to see you again.
Good to see you, Dan.
And I've learned a lot about your models and your way of working. I appreciate your very frank and open answers.
I'm glad to instruct you, Dan, anytime you have any questions about me.
I would though like to go in a slightly different direction. You were known for having influenced a number of male artists during your days, a number of followers like the Duvnik brother or the Duvnik boys and the Greaves brothers, even Walter Sickert. But I wonder if you influenced any female artists and what you might have thought of their work.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I either instructed or inspired many women artists. You know, both Maud and Trixie exhibited work, and then there was the Académie Carmen in Paris. Now, you have heard, I know you, Dan, have heard of this atelier that I directed for several years in the 1890s. So you will also know that I favored my female students over the men. I had long believed that women painters represented the future of art, and I relished the opportunity to train them properly. And to be honest, their minority status in the art world made them more teachable than men. They better appreciated the need for training, and unlike some male students, they did not see me as a potential rival in the art world. Not that any of my students ever became my rivals. Besides, as I've already suggested in an earlier moment, I generally find women more interesting than men, present company, of course, excepted. Doubtless the most successful of my female students was Gwendolyn John, whose brother Augustus also, as I understand it, achieved something of a reputation. But the woman who most impressed me was Inez Bate. She was Irish by birth, and she eventually ran the school for me. And I took the extraordinary step of legally making her my apprentice, complete with a document of indenture. Unfortunately, it seems today that her reputation has been overshadowed by that of her far less gifted husband, Clifford Adams, whom she met while a student.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. That was a very interesting kind of not really off subject, but very interesting question. Our next and last question is from Michael Biscoe, our honorary secretary.
Good evening, Mr. Whistler.
Hello, Michael.
It's been most interesting listening to you this evening. My question is a bit off-piste as well, but it's a subject that's been fascinating me for a long time. And this is that the development of photography in the 19th century freed artists from the responsibility of creating a historical record in their work. Thus emerged Impressionism and eventually abstract and conceptual art. How far was your portraiture, especially of women, influenced by the development of photography?
That is a very interesting question to address. Let me begin by saying that unlike some painters of my generation, I never feared the advent of photography. You may be familiar with a Punch cartoon by George du Maurier. It shows me entering a photographer's studio to make fun of him as an artist. More than 20 years later, I made a watercolor, Blue and Opal, the photographer, to ridicule the hopelessness of photographing a seascape. And I should also note that in terms of freeing artists from the historical record, I was never about creating a historical record. I was trying to create a mood, a sensation, something that people would respond to aesthetically. And if nature did not yield what I was looking for, as it often failed to do, I would take the motion necessary to reproduce what I saw in my mind, not what I saw with my eyes. But I had grown up with photography. I had first posed for a camera when I was just 10 years old, and several of my friends were avid amateur photographers, and I applied photographic principles of perspective and depth in many of my etchings. I owned photos of paintings by other artists, and I photographed my own work extensively. I even issued a limited edition photographic album of my 1892 exhibition, Nocturnes, Marines, and Chevalier Pieces. And remember that until the early 20th century, color photography was a rarity. And while many people, including myself, posed for the camera, a proper portrait could only be painted. As for my impressionistic brushwork, that is how I saw the world. To me, it was a realistic view. But as I told a journalist in 1878, the imitator is a poor kind of creature. If the artist painted only the tree or flower before him, then the king of artists would indeed be the photographer. But it is the artist's task to go beyond this. In portraiture, to put on canvas something more than the face the model wears for that one day, to paint the person, in short, as well as her features. Now, if anything, my work, especially my nocturnes, influenced the advancement of photography. My name appears scores of times in photographic journals during and well beyond my lifetime. Photographers who wish to shed their reputations as mere technicians revered me and proclaimed themselves pictorialists in pursuit of artistic photography. They sought what amounted to an aesthetic movement in photography, their goal being to produce pictures that looked like paintings. Now, again, this was not in portraiture, but many photographers titled their misty landscapes nocturnes. I believe one of the leading figures in this movement, Peter Henry Emerson, went so far as to write in 1892, "The subject of a picture is to seek a decorative scheme or pattern, either of line or color. What could be more Whistlerian than that?"
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting answer. Thank you.
Yes, and quite on spot. And I think that
Oh
oh
dear.
dear,
Oh,
wait,
oh no.
are we losing you?
I seem to be,
No.
I think I am fading.
No.
I'm fading fast. I enjoyed my time with you. Please do call up again. It can be rather tiresome here beyond space and time, but I do have my oils and some of my models here with me. Thank you again, my friends.
Thank you, Mr. Whistler.
Thank you. Thank you.
And now,
Well,
heard from our chairman.
well, Mr. Whistler, as tantalizing as ever, as difficult as ever to deal with. We love you deeply. You inspire us, you entertain us, and you make us laugh. Thank you so much. What we've learned tonight has been remarkable, and that wouldn't have happened without the work of Professor Dan Sutherland, who worked with Mr. Whistler on an ethereal level to create this fantastic mystery. And of course, without Joan Harper, it wouldn't have happened at all. The technology is astonishing. And I dare say behind the scenes, her husband, Michael Biscoe, who floats in and out this evening, has been a huge help too. And thank you all for taking part. This is our fourth seance with James McNeill Whistler. They evolved through lockdown, and I'm delighted we've continued them because they're such a simple way of becoming involved with society, enjoying the company of Mr. Whistler, portrayed with absolutely exquisite charm by Darcy Sullivan. And thank you so much. It's been a